So how DAV helps? DAV is a charity. We are a nonprofit organization. We are not government related. We are a 501c4. And the reason why we're a C4 is because we have registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C., part of our organization, and they lobby our legislators to advance legislation to benefit us. We do empower all generations of veterans, their families, and survivors. So we're not limited to one generation. We help all generations of veterans. And then all of DAV's services are free at no cost or obligation to the veterans and families that we assist. That's very important to understand. Anyone who is with DAV should never be asking for money. And it's really important that you know that we exist for free and that you're hopefully not paying a lawyer or one of those other companies that is going after your money. We'll always do it for free. Next slide.
Can you speak closer to the mic, please?
Yes, I can. Is that better? I'm just getting, okay, thank you. Yes, I'll speak up. So our mission statement, just really quick, we are dedicated to a single purpose, empowering veterans to lead high quality lives with respect and dignity. We accomplish this by ensuring that veterans and their families can access the full range of benefits available to them, fighting for the interests of America's injured heroes on Capitol Hill, and educating the public about the great sacrifices and needs of veterans transitioning back to civilian life. So we have several departments involved in DAV. I am part of the service department, and I failed to mention this, but I do have Sherry Green. She's our supervisor in Honolulu, and she's in the chat function, and so she'll be answering any of the questions that are pertinent to my presentation, just as a mention of that. Regarding the fighting for interests of America's injured heroes on Capitol Hill, like I said, we have a legislative team in Washington, D.C., and they're advancing the legislation in Washington, D.C. Next slide. There are 5 ways to service connect PTSD. Today, we are here to talk about how to get PTSD service connected that's related to the personal assault or MST. Next slide. And then this is I popped the slide in, so let me just read a little bit off of it. One of the questions was regarding, do I have to report the incident? It's a common myth, like Dr. Whittaker said. The assault does not have to have been reported to file a claim. It's very important. Even if it's been 40 years, it's never too late to file a claim. The VA must legally corroborate that the MST personal assault occurred. Again, the regulation supports this, and I'll talk about that in a couple of more slides. That if you are active duty, so one of the questions was, if I'm active duty, what is the best thing I can do to help myself once I retire? And I wanted to address the best thing you can do is to first take care of yourself. If you have any concerns, you should bring them up to your mental health provider or your primary care doctor and get those concerns about your mental health addressed while you're on active duty. And I'm not sure if someone has their mic not muted, but I just wanted to mention if someone could ever mute their mics. So if you're active duty, the best thing you could do, again, is to bring any concerns forward to your providers, get that documented while you're on active duty prior to discharge, okay? You can file your claim for the VA the best time is between 90 to 180 days from discharge. You can still, just while you're active duty, 0 to 89 days, but the best time is 90 to 180 days out from discharge. And like I said, it's never too late to file a claim. If you are already receiving benefits for PTSD, you can always file a claim for an increase. So if, for example, if a veteran is rated for 50% for PTSD and their symptoms become worse because PTSD psych kind of ebbs and flows, they should file a claim for an increase. They'd be reevaluated and then re-adjudicated. The VA would give them a new decision based on that recent exam. And then one of the other questions was records that could be helpful for the claim. On the claim form, we will list any treatment at any VA or DOD facility. We'll list that on the claim form, and the VA will get those records. If there are private records, there's a form that we can authorize the VA to get those records from our private providers. And I'll talk about one of the development letters because several other questions were regarding the development letters and the confusion for those. The other question that came up was, can I give examples and outcomes from claims? I can't give examples because truly, like Dr. Whittaker said, everybody's situation and experience is completely different. I've been doing this 13 years and no two claims are exactly alike. I'll talk at the end more about like the common reasons I see for denial, but I can talk about the outcomes. I just had my regional office director pull this data for me, so I'm very appreciative of that. But the MST grant rate is 55%. So this is 144,000 grants out of approximately 250,000 claims. The grant rate for women is 59% and men is 47%. And that's compared to the overall grant rate within the Veterans Benefits Administration of 65%. So if you consider of all claims, approximately 65% are granted, MST related is about 55%. 81% of MST granted conditions are PTSD. What that means is the remainder of those claimed conditions are physical conditions related to that MST experience. And this data goes back to 2011. Next slide, please. Okay, so this regulation can look pretty daunting. I did split it up into 3 sections. So this is part of the 38 Code of Federal Regulations, 3.304F5. And the yellow part is highlighted in yellow details the evidence from sources other than the veteran's service records that may corroborate the veteran's account of the stressor incident. The key words here is if a PTSD claim is based on an in-service personal assault. The VA is saying that we acknowledge that a lot of them are not reported. And so a lot of these events are not reported. So we've created this looser regulation to identify that there's other things that could help corroborate this event. The other key word here is if a PTSD claim is received, it has to be a claim for PTSD. We can't claim that like depression related to MST. We have to have it's best to file a claim for PTSD related to MST. And it's because the regulation specifically states that the looser regulations around the development for it is a claim for PTSD. The green part details the evidence of behavior changes that can corroborate the veteran's account that the stressor incident occurred. Posty, I do see that you have a chat question. I don't know, Sherry, if you can answer that question. But the key part of that here is that there's evidence of behavior changes, okay? So focusing on, we have an event that occurred, it's likely not reported, and it's not going to be in our records. And so what we need to focus on when we file a claim for PTSD due to this event is supporting evidence that shows and supports that our behavior changed in some way. I'll detail more of that here in a couple more slides. And then finally in blue, that details what VA must advise the veteran of and is the basis of the MST development letter, meaning when the VA receives a claim for PTSD due to MST, there's a development letter that must go out to the veteran. This is because this regulation says that they can't deny the claim until the VA legally tells them what kind of evidence could be helpful. And then also that an exam request can be done and an opinion can be obtained. Next slide.
Carmen, can I stop you real quick for a couple questions?
Yes.
Somebody is wondering what it means that the VA has to legally corroborate that MST occurred.
Because there's no proof, like there's no, if it's not reported, there's no evidence I didn't report it, I didn't tell anybody about it. And so what the VA is saying is that they have to corroborate that something happened. That's what the
way they do that is
the legal regulation says that they have to corroborate it. And listen, I testified in front of Congress about this exact situation. Is if you're in combat and you say if you're afraid for your life, the VA automatically says, okay, you're afraid for your life, and we agree that your in-service stressor is conceded. But a survivor to MST has to essentially prove that this event occurred by all of this corroboration. And so I testified to Congress saying this is an absurd evidentiary burden on the survivor. Excuse me. But the regulation as it stands right now is that we have to corroborate it with evidence.
Okay, and then another question is, someone has a PTSD diagnosis from a civilian therapist. Does she need a Navy psychologist to also diagnose PTSD for it to be recognized? No.
No. Any evidence of any sort of mental health treatment, we would submit as evidence, and then that doesn't mean that the VA won't give an examination, but it's all of that is excellent evidence for your claim that you received any sort of mental health treatment, even if they diagnose something else. We would submit all of that for evidence.
And does PTSD have to be a part of the claim to receive benefits? Or is other evidence sufficient?
So we have to file a claim the claim is for the condition and the diagnosis is PTSD. The event, like Dr. Whittaker said, is related to MST versus like combat or something else. So we file a claim for PTSD, and the purpose of filing a claim for PTSD is in order to receive disability compensation, because this diagnosis that's related to my military service is causing me some sort of social or occupational impairment, which is the whole purpose of disability compensation. Does that make sense? So we do have to file for PTSD in order for the claim process to work. And
you couldn't, for example, file for depression related to MST.
Okay, so that's a great question. Is the claim has to be for PTSD due to MST. A claim for depression, the VA is going to look for direct service connection, meaning they're going to look in your service treatment records for evidence of or diagnosis of depression. And if that's there, then that's a claim for depression, and they would process that. The problem is a huge number of us have an incident in service. We don't have any treatment of any sort of mental health condition in service. We have a number of years that passes, and then we finally, everything comes to a head and we need to seek treatment, or we need to file, we decide, and it's very courageous, we decide to file a claim with the VA, but there's no real documentation in service or really after service, medical wise. And so the claim should be for PTSD. If you have in-service treatment for a mental health condition, then you can file for that condition. But I'm talking about like PTSD to MST. That's the best way to get an exam is PTSD to MST. And again, I could talk forever about this. It can get a little bit convoluted. I'm happy to look at individual cases following, this event, but PTSD to MST is what we're talking about. Any other questions you want me to talk about, or you want me to move forward?
Keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So the next slide, please. Okay. So when we file a claim for PTSD due to MST, there's this form that must be present with the claim. If it's not present with the claim, then the VA will solicit for this form. And this is a very triggering form. At the top of the form, there's information for the Veterans Crisis Line at the top, and to include the number for tech support. So please use that if you need to while you're doing this form. The other thing, and this is one of the questions that was done in advance, was this process is very traumatizing, and it's very frustrating, and it's very stressful. This can be very stressful and re-traumatizing, especially when the veteran files their claim with a typed out statement. So they get the courage, they type out their whole statement about what happened, and they file the claim form, and it's a very detailed account of what happened. And then the VA then says, we received your claim, and here's this form. The reason why is because the VA has to have certain information in order to cross-reference federal records, and in order to try to corroborate, like I said, corroborate, and that's an infuriating term, and the process is infuriating, I understand, because the VA is following their process. This form is a checkbox, it's required for the claim, and so it is very stressful and traumatizing to submit your claim and then be told, okay, now you have to do it all over again in this form. The really important part of this form is the detailed information of the unit, the time frame, the location as far as city, state of the event, of the incident. And then the part that we can be more general in and not detailed is the actual description of the incident. And I've given my feedback up to VA central office on this form because a description of incident, from my point of view, and if I'm a survivor, I'm thinking I have to put everything down, and that's not the situation. We can say only, I was sexually assaulted, I experienced sexual harassment. It can be literally that simple. And these are the symptoms I immediately started experiencing. So then you can start detailing the symptoms that you experienced, and we don't have to detail or relive or re-traumatize ourselves with the actual details of the assault. Does that make sense? So it's very important. Focus on the details as far as unit, time frame, dates, stuff like that. That something happened, with sexual assault, with sexual harassment. And then moving on to the next slide. So the next slide is detailing, okay, this happened. These are the symptoms I began experiencing, and these are how it impacted me. So any changes in performance and performance evaluation, if there was any pregnancy tests for HIV or STDs, any unexplained economic or social behavior changes, a breakup of a primary relationship. So this gives examples, okay, just to help prompt you. That's the more important part of the statement, not going into the incident itself, but really how did it impact you? Talking about the changes in behavior and how that changed your life, okay? Because again, 3.304, the regulation is looking for evidence that may corroborate the veteran's account of the stressor incident. So that's what we're looking to identify. Go ahead, next slide.
Just a 10-minute warning.
Okay, no problem. I'll be done by that. The next form is the lay statement, witness statement form. The development letter that I'll come to here in a minute doesn't give you this form exactly. It just says you can submit, the regulation says examples of such evidence that can corroborate the veteran's account include statements from family members, roommates. They don't send you this form, so it's helpful to know this form exists because it gives you the veteran's information, the witness buddy statements information, and then if you go to the next slide, this is where they should detail the change in behavior that they witnessed, okay? They're very important to know that these can be statements regarding a change in behavior. It's the change in behavior that is the key. Even if the individual never knew what happened. I think one of the questions was, what if I didn't tell anybody? What if I've never, and sometimes I'm the first person that someone's ever told when they're trying to file a claim. So it's very important. Even if you've never told a soul that this has happened, we don't have to have told a soul. What we're focusing in on is the change in behavior. And so an example of that is, hey, I was their roommate, and I remember, going to church all the time and working out, and then kind of out of nowhere that changed, and he or she began to start drinking a lot and using drugs, or staying up all night or sleeping all day. Any change in that behavior was kind of out of the norm. And so what that would look like if I'm the claimant is I would approach my friend, my roommate, my family member is, hey, remember that time when we were really active in church, but then I kind of dropped off and it was kind of weird. Can you write a statement detailing that? So that's what I want to, again, focus in on. I don't have to then come to my family member and tell them what happened. I just need to prompt to get a statement regarding the change in behavior. So I hope that helps make sense. Go ahead and next slide. So this is a kind of a snippet of a development letter that the VA sends out, and this is sent out in regardless of what is received with the claim. And there's a couple key pieces of information. Some of this Dr. Whittaker has already covered, but the VBA, Veterans Benefits Administration, is required to send this information out. So it's a link to find the MST coordinator in their area. It's an information about the free treatment for any health condition, which again, Dr. Whittaker detailed. So it talks about that. And then it provides them the contact information for the MST coordinator in their area based on their physical mailing address. And then go ahead, next slide. And then it talks about because of the regulation, it tells them we have to tell the veteran what evidence could be helpful for their claim. And I think a lot of claimants get this and think, well, the VA is kind of shaming me for not reporting it because they're saying, well, you didn't report it, or if you have this report, well, of course I don't have a report because I didn't report it. And why would I report it? It's so stressful. And so this is all just a legal requirement. They have to send this information. And then go ahead and next slide. All right, so a really quick recap, because again, keep in mind I can make this 4 hours, is the first thing is the VA is receiving a claim for PTSD due to MST. The second thing is the veteran needs to submit that 21-0781 alpha. That's that statement of supportive claim for the stressor statement form. And then what will happen is they should also send a new lay statement. So any other evidence that would support, corroborate, like keying in on that change in behavior, anything extra is great. Like if there is any record of, a pregnancy test in service or outside of service, anything that we can use to corroborate that. I am an expert at looking through records and looking at statements and helping this information. So I'd be happy to do that. VA will request and obtain records, all those federal records that they know exist. They'll get any private records that we've authorized, and then they'll get an examination. So go ahead, next slide. This is just one of the questions was, can we please touch on basically the VA can grant service connection for one mental disorder. They're not going to, if you already have a rating for depression at 100%, you wouldn't now claim PTSD due to MST because you already have a rating for one mental disorder. So it's there's a list of mental disorders, and there's just one rating criteria, which is actually the part of the next slide. Actually, I want to go over PTSD exam. Heads up. Can you go next slide? Okay. So before we talk about the exam and I show you examples, a couple of things. We have to be open and honest. So even if there's things that we've never told anybody in our whole life about how we've been impacted, we have to tell the examiner. And listen, I want to tell you this because I want to normalize the conversation, and I want to talk about it's hard. You're going to a provider that we don't know. There's no rapport. They're not there to really treat you at all. And you have to disclose everything to them. And that's really uncomfortable and that sucks. And so it's really important that you know that that's part of the process, and you give yourself some grace on that day. Like if you can take off work, don't commit to a dinner party that night. And that we know we have to do this as part of the process. And then the other thing is relating symptoms back to service as much as possible. This event happened in service, and these are my symptoms that have been constant or have gotten worse or better, worse over time. And we can talk about divorce, how these symptoms ended up in a divorce situation or loss of family member. That's really sad, but that's not the reason why I have these symptoms. It's because of this event in service. And then also the worst day. So what I mean by that is our tendency is to say like, hey, Carmen, how are you doing? And I'm like, I'm really great, even though if inside I'm not doing very great. We have to answer based on our worst day. We don't want to sugarcoat anything. We're all very proud, and it's very difficult to really admit maybe how we're actually doing. And during that examination, it's really, really important that we admit and we're honest with that examiner of how we are really doing. Okay. Next
Carmen,
slide. Yeah.
Carmen, a quick question. Someone's asking, what if their PTSD is related to some MST from something on active duty and then also something additional after they left active duty? In this interview, how do they try to disentangle that?
Sure. We would focus on the incident that happened during service. Not that not that you can't disclose the after, but we're gonna want the examiner to focus on their opinion that there is a diagnosis of PTSD and it's related to this verified stressor in service. And so it could be that the post-discharge event exacerbated it, but we're really going to focus on what happened in service.
Thank you.
And then let's see, next slide. Okay, so to talk about the general rating criteria for mental disorders, again, it's one criteria regardless of the diagnosis. It goes 100, 70, 50, 30, 10, and 0. Starting at the worst, you'll see a couple parts of the rating criteria. It's split into one part that we call the occupational and social impairment, which is part of the situation. And then it lists symptoms listed out, okay? And it's important to kind of have an idea of what this looks like, because no one walks around saying, I'm having an unprovoked irritability with periods of violence. Like, no, I just have a temper I have an outburst of anger because I'm so built up, right? And so it's kind of good to look at this and have examples of impaired impulse control, for example. 100, 70, 50, 30, 10, and 0. So the next slide is the rest of the criteria. Again, regardless of the diagnosis, the same rating criteria is utilized. I will caveat that to the eating disorders, those do have their own rating criteria. Regardless of diagnosis of eating disorder, that's its own rating criteria. Next slide. So this is taken directly from a PTSD or mental disorder examination. The examiner will have to check mark one of these boxes, and it's literally where that check mark is corresponds directly with that rating criteria that's going to be granted by the VA. So these are all the occupational and social impairments, again, directly correlate with the VA rating criteria. And then next slide. The second main part of the VA examination is the PTSD exam symptoms. And so why do we want to be honest and forthcoming with all of the symptoms of how we're actually impaired? Because we need as many of these check marked as possible accurately by the examiner. If we go in and we sugarcoat everything and know we're fine and we don't disclose really how we're doing, we only might get a couple of those check marked. What does that do? That equates to a lower evaluation, which once this exam report is of record, then we're gonna have a really hard time getting, arguing that if we have to go for a higher evaluation. Next slide. All right, so really recap, we have to have a corroborated incident in service. We have to have a current diagnosis of PTSD. We just need to get you to an examination, or the veteran to an examination. If on exam, the diagnosis is different than PTSD, then the VA can grant service connection for, say, depression claimed as PTSD. But getting to that exam part and getting through that whole claim process, the claim has to be for PTSD, but they can grant service connection and call it something different. And then a medical opinion saying that this is related to that event in service. If all three of those are present, the VA will grant service connection. If they're missing one or more elements, they'll deny service connection. The evaluation directly comes from where the check marks are on examination. It's literally that simple. Okay, next slide. See. All right, so expectations. All MST claims are filtered through San Juan, Puerto Rico. That has created a huge bottleneck. That was done about a year ago, probably 2 years ago now, because Dr. Whittaker, time flies. So anything, if PTSD MST is on the claim as one of the claimed contentions, the entire claim goes through San Juan. So just expect a really long time for it to go through. A couple of things is, if you want DAV to assist you, we're going to get you a couple forms. One is a power of attorney, so that DAV, I can get access to your VA claims file. Any one of our national service officers, we can see your VA claims file and help you. And then also an intent to file, which just preserves an effective date. And if your claim is ultimately denied, it's very important to get someone trained in the process to look at your specific case and identify what the VA is missing, which one of those elements is missing, and give you very specific guidance on what evidence that you can obtain and kind of gather to come back to the table, hopefully within a year, with a supplemental claim. Next slide.
Carmen?
Yes.
A couple of people are wondering if they need separate forms if they have multiple events involving different people and spanning numerous years.
So it's 0781 alpha, and you would do as many of those to cover as many of your incidents as possible. I would probably just try to go like the most easily verified events, because the VA is then going to have to go through and try to corroborate all of these different events. So we want to kind of make it easier for the VA and also easier for yourself, and just stick with the I hate to say this term, like the main couple. You can put as many as you want, and you would just use as many of those forms as possible to list them all out. but I would say that's unnecessary. We just really need one. Okay. The last thing is DAV just released a women veterans report, and then my slides are pretty much done, February 27th. And so it's called the Journey to Mental Wellness. Very, very good report, and that just talks about the gaps in care for women veterans. Next slide. Okay, so following this presentation, I'll be here. I have not been on the keeping track of the chat or anything in there, but I will stay after as long as I need to. Here is what you can do is if you have a representative that you're already a VSO, Veteran Service Officer, that you're already working with, I would say just keep working with them. If you want to outreach your local National Service Officer with DAV, you can go to benefitsquestions.org and input your zip code and send them a message. If you want my assistance or Sherry's assistance, I'm going to try to absorb as many of these as I possibly can. You can send the power of attorney and intent to file, and I'll make sure that we get those forms, and then send them to dav.vbaden@va.gov. Put the subject line PTSD seminar follow-up, and then my office will get that uploaded to the VA. I'll review your file. I'll connect with you individually and review your individual case and help you from there. So that is all of my slides. So whatever questions that you want to field at this time, I'm happy to do whatever you guys need at this point.
Thank you, Carmen. We definitely have